One night, crossing forbidden boundaries left us wrapped in emotions we could no longer deny. The house lay in a deep silence that seemed to press down on everything, the kind of stillness that makes even the walls feel alive with secrets. I lay there, eyes open, tracing the faint lines of moonlight stretching across the ceiling. My mind too restless to find peace. Tonight, memories swirled how everything had shifted in this house, how our lives had turned upside down since Eric and his mom moved in. It's strange how life brings people together, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that my stepson had somehow drifted even farther from me. It was an adjustment for both of us, and while I tried to get close, there always seemed to be this unspoken distance between us. I'd catch him glancing my way, almost as if he was sizing me up, but he'd never say much, just disappear back into his room. I wondered if he was feeling as out of place as I was. Tonight, though, was different. There was an unexplainable tension hanging in the air, something that made me feel like I was waiting for something to happen. The soft creak of a floorboard snapped me out of my thoughts. I froze ears, straining sure that I'd imagined it. But there it was, again a light, almost tentative footstep coming from somewhere down the hallway. I glanced over at the clock on my nightstand. It was well past midnight. Who else could be up at this hour? I considered getting up, but something in me hesitated. Maybe it was instinct or maybe just plain curiosity. But I found myself lying there, holding my breath, listening to the faint sounds of someone moving down the hall. My heart picked up that familiar thrill of tension taking over, and I couldn't help but wonder who it could be. The sounds grew closer, pausing just outside my door. I gripped the edge of the blanket, feeling my pulse quicken as the handle turned and a door creaked open a sliver. For a moment, nothing happened, just a sliver of darkness beyond the door frame, as if someone were standing there, watching, waiting. I stayed absolutely still, wondering if maybe it was all in my head. Then, without a sound, the door eased shut, and I heard those same soft footsteps retreating back down the hall. I didn't move for a long time, my mind racing with questions. Has anyone been there? And if so, why would they come to my door only to leave without a word? After a few tense minutes, I finally convinced myself it was just my imagination, but no sooner had I settled back into bed than my phone lit up beside me. The screen glowed with a single message from Eric Can't Sleep Either. It read. I stared at the message, feeling a strange mix of relief and surprise. It was rare for Eric to reach out like that. He usually kept to himself, always guarded, always distant. I quickly typed back a response, but before I could send it, I heard the soft creak of the hallway floor again. My heart skipped a beat as the sound grew closer, coming to a stop outside my door. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone was there. I waited, every nerve in my body on high alert, but the silence stretched on. Unbroken. I couldn't take it any longer. I slipped quietly out of bed, crept toward the door, and eased it open. The hallway was empty, but a faint light spilled out from the bottom of Eric's door. At the end of the hall, I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and walked toward his room, trying to figure out what I was going to say. As I raised my hand to knock, I noticed the door wasn't fully closed. I hesitated, glancing inside. Eric was sitting on the edge of his bed, his face illuminated by the dim glow of his phone. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. You're awake too, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah? I said, feeling suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. I thought I heard something. Did you come to my door earlier? Eric's eyes flickered, a strange look crossing his face, before he quickly masked it with a casual shrug. Maybe I just needed to check on things. His words hung in the air, laced with something I couldn't quite place. Are you all right? I asked, choosing my words carefully. Eric wasn't one to open up easily, and I didn't want to push too hard. But there was something in the way. He looked at me tonight, something that felt off. He hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he might actually tell me what was on his mind. But then he looked away, shaking his head. It's nothing, just couldn't sleep. The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable, and I found myself searching for something to say, anything to fill the void. But the truth was, I didn't know what to say. The distance between us had never felt so vast, and yet for the first time, it felt like we were on the edge of something unspoken, something simmering just below the surface, all right. Well, if you need anything, I'm just down the hall, I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. Eric nodded, but he didn't look at me. He was already back to staring at his phone, lost in his own world. I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, he spoke, his voice so soft I almost missed it. Thanks for checking on me. I nodded, unsure of what to say. I could feel his gaze on my back as I left, the weight of his unspoken words lingering in the air, long after I had closed his door. I returned to my room, slipping under the covers, but sleep was a distant memory. The house felt different, somehow heavier, like it was holding onto secrets I couldn't quite unravel. I lay there replaying the events of the night over and over, trying to make sense of it all. Why had Eric come to my door? Why had he looked at me like that, like he wanted to say something, but couldn't bring himself to speak? And why did I feel like there was more going on than I could see? Just as I was about to drift off, my phone buzzed again, another message from Eric. Good night. It read simple and unassuming, but somehow it only made me feel more unsettled. I typed back a quick response, setting my phone on the nightstand and closing my eyes. But no matter how hard I tried, sleep wouldn't come. The house was silent once again, but that tension, that strange feeling of something lurking just out of sight, remained hanging over me like a shadow and deep down. I knew one thing for certain: this night was only the beginning. The following morning felt surreal, as if the events of last night were nothing more than a strange dream that lingered in the corners of my mind. But as I made my way down the stairs, the weight of it all pressed in on me. The stillness of the house seemed thicker. Somehow, as if it held onto secrets, we were both unwilling to speak out loud. When I walked into the kitchen, Eric was already there, leaning against the counter, his eyes fixed on a steaming mug in his hands. He glanced up as I entered, his expression guarded, and for a brief moment I could see something flicker in his gaze, a mixture of hesitation and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Morninging, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, feeling a strange tension settle between us. It was the same tension that had been there ever since we became a family, but today it felt sharper, more palpable. I busied myself making coffee, trying to ignore the pickling sensation at the back of my neck, as if his eyes were still on me. Did you sleep? I asked, my voice sounding more casual than I felt. He shrugged, taking a sip from his mug, couldn't stop thinking about things. His words hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me. There was so much left unsaid between us, so much we tiptoed around pretending it wasn't there. But today, it felt like all those unspoken words were threatening to spill over, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face them. I took a deep breath, summoning the courage to ask the question that had been gnawing at me since last night. Eric, about last night. Did you come to my door? He looked at me, his gaze steady, but there was something hidden behind his eyes, a hint of something vulnerable, almost conflicted. He hesitated, and for a moment I thought he might deny it. But then he nodded, a barely perceptible movement, as if he were admitting a truth he didn't want to acknowledge. I wanted to check on you, make sure you were okay, he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. I nodded, trying to make sense of his words, but there was something about the way he was looking at me, something that made my pulse quicken, an unspoken tension crackling between us like a live wire. I appreciate it, I replied, forcing myself to maintain eye contact, though it felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. He held my gaze for a moment longer, his eyes searching mine as if he were trying to find something there. But then he looked away, his shoulders tense, as if he were carrying a weight too heavy to bear. The silence between us stretched on thick and uncomfortable, and I found myself wondering what it was that kept him up at night. What it was that made him come to my door. There was a part of me that wanted to ask to dig deeper, but another part that was too afraid of what I might find. The rest of the day passed in a blur. We went about our route, Inez moving through the same familiar motions. But there was a lingering tension in the air that neither of us could shake. I could feel his presence, a constant awareness that settled under my skin, making every interaction feel loaded with unspoken words. Later that afternoon, we found ourselves in the living room, each pretending to be engrossed in our own tasks, but I could sense his gaze flickering toward me now and then. I could feel the weight of his attention like a physical presence in the room, and it made my heart beat faster, my breath catching in my throat. He was sitting on the couch, his head resting on his hand as he stared at the TV, though I doubted he was really watching. I couldn't help but steal a glance in his direction, and for a moment our eyes met. His expression softened, and there was a vulnerability there, something that made my chest tighten. "You know, it's weird," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "I never thought things would be like this, us here together." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. There was something in his tone, a hint of regret, or maybe a longing for something different. "Yeah, life has a way of surprising you," I said, offering him a small smile. He looked down his fingers, fidgeting with a loose thread on his sleeve. "Sometimes I wonder if things had been different. You know, if we'd met under other circumstances, maybe things wouldn't feel." So he trailed off as if searching for the right word tense. I offered, and he gave a slight nod. His expression thoughtful, yeah, tense. He echoed his eyes, meeting mine again, and there was a sadness there, a longing that made my heart ache. I opened my mouth to say something, to tell him that things didn't have to be this way. But the words died on my lips, because the truth was, I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us. I didn't know how to reach him, how to ease the tension that seemed to hang between us, like a shadow. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of awkward silences and stolen glances. Every time I caught him looking at me, I felt a strange flutter in my chest, a mixture of confusion and something else, something I couldn't quite name. It was as if we were both standing on the edge of something that could change everything. But neither of us dared to take the leap that night as I lay in bed. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me, the way his eyes had softened, the way he'd seemed so vulnerable, so lost. I wanted to reach out to him to tell him that he didn't have to go through this alone. But I didn't know how sleep was elusive once again, and I found myself lying there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of him. I wondered if he was lying awake too, if he was thinking about me, about the tension that seemed to grow with each passing day. The hours ticked by, and just when I thought I might drift off, I heard it again, the soft creak of the hallway floor. My heart leaped, and I held my breath listening as the footsteps drew closer, pausing just outside my door. This time, I couldn't stay still. I slipped out of bed, my pulse pounding in my ears, and opened the door. Eric was standing there, his face partially obscured by the shadows, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "Eric!" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He looked at me, and for a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other in the dim light of the hallway. There was a vulnerability in his gaze, a rawness that made my chest tighten. I couldn't sleep. He murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, feeling the same restlessness, the same tension that had been building between us for days, weeks, even months. Without thinking, I stepped aside, letting him into the room. He hesitated, but then stepped inside, his movement slow, almost hesitant. The silence stretched between us, thick and charged as we stood there, each of us searching for the right words, the words that might make sense of this strange connection. We'd both been dancing around, but there were no words, just a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the tension that simmered beneath the surface. He looked at me, his gaze softening, and for a brief moment I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite place, something that felt like hope, or maybe relief, as if we were finally letting down the walls we'd both been holding up for so long. I didn't know what was happening between us, didn't know where this would lead, but as we stood there, the weight of our shared silence pressing down on us, I felt a strange sense of comfort, like for the first time we were finally seeing each other, truly seeing each other without the barriers we'd both put up. And though the air was thick with unspoken words with questions, we didn't dare to ask. I knew one thing for certain. Whatever this was, it was only the beginning. The days blurred together, each one filled with the same tense silences and fleeting glances. I tried to go about life as if everything were normal, as if we hadn't crossed a line, one that deep down I knew would change everything. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I could feel it between us, an unspoken connection growing stronger with each passing day. Evening had fallen, and the house was quiet. I was in the kitchen, absent-minded, wiping down the counter, trying to keep my hands busy. Eric entered the room, and suddenly the air felt charged. There was a strange energy between us, an intensity that neither of us could ignore. He leaned against the doorway, watching me with a contemplative look, as if he were weighing something important. I felt my pulse quicken, a mixture of anticipation and trepidation, settling in my chest. "You always keep yourself busy, don't you?" He asked, a hint of a smile on his lips. I shrugged, trying to keep my tone light. It helps to pass the time. There was a pause, and I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his gaze making my skin prickle. With awareness, he stepped closer, his movement slow and deliberate, until he was standing just a few inches away. "It must get lonely." He murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper. I swallowed the distance between us, feeling both too close and not close enough. Sometimes I admitted my voice barely audible. His gaze softened, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something vulnerable, maybe even tender. The moment stretched on, and I felt the air around us grow thicker, charged with unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. It was as if we were both standing on the edge, waiting for someone to take the leap. Then, without warning, he reached out his fingers, brushing against my arm, light and tentative. The touch sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I looked up at him, my heart pounding as our eyes met, and in that instant, I knew there was no turning back. Slowly, he leaned closer, his gaze never leaving mine. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to stop this before it went any further. But my body betrayed me, drawn to him like a magnet. Our faces were inches apart, the space between us charged with attention so intense it was almost tangible, and then his lips met mine. It was a tentative kiss, soft and uncertain, as if he were testing the waters, waiting to see if I would pull away, but I didn't. I couldn't. I felt myself leaning into him, my hand reaching up to rest on his shoulder, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, a slow, intoxicating dance that left me breathless and wanting more. His hands moved to my waist, steadying me as he pressed against me, his touch firm yet gentle. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, a steady, grounding presence that made my heart race and my head spin. The world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us lost in this moment, caught in a connection we couldn't deny. For a moment, everything felt perfect. The doubts, the fears, the tension, all of it melted away, leaving only the pure, unfiltered desire that had been simmering between us for so long. It was as if we were finally allowing ourselves to feel, to let down our guard and embrace the emotions we'd both been hiding. But reality came crashing back all too quickly. I pulled away, breathing heavily, my mind racing as the gravity of what we'd just done sank in. Eric looked at me, his expression, a mixture of confusion and vulnerability, as if he were trying to make sense of it all. "I don't know if this is." I trailed off, unable to find the words to express the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. He looked away, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." He stopped, shaking his head, as if he didn't know how to finish the sentence. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. No, it's not your fault. This is complicated. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. Yeah, I know, it's just sometimes it feels like you're the only person who really understands me. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, a reminder of the connection we'd shared long before this moment, long before any lines had been crossed. There was a bond between us, something deep and unbreakable, and yet it was that very connection that made everything feel so overwhelming, so impossible. We stood there in silence, the weight of our shared understanding pressing down on us. I wanted to reach out to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but I didn't know if I could. I didn't know if there was a way to move forward without losing everything we had. Finally, Eric broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we should just pretend this never happened. I felt a pang of sadness at his words, but I knew he was right. We couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal, that there was nothing between us. But at the same time, we couldn't let this moment define us. We had to find a way to move on, to rebuild the boundaries that had been broken. Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. Maybe that's for the best. But as I said the words, a part of me knew that it wouldn't be that simple. You can't unfeel something once you've felt it, can't erase a connection once it's been made. And as I looked at him standing there with that same conflicted expression on his face, I knew that this was far from over. In the days that followed, we tried to go back to normal, to pretend that nothing had happened. We went through the motions, each of us careful not to cross any lines to keep our distance, but the tension was still there, simmering beneath the surface, a constant reminder of the connection. We'd both tried so hard to ignore, and every time our eyes met, every time I caught a glimpse of that same vulnerability in his gaze, I felt a pang of longing, a yearning for something that could never be. One evening, as we sat in the living room, each of us lost in our own thoughts, he finally broke the silence. You know, it doesn't have to be like this. I looked up, surprised by the intensity in his gaze. What do you mean? He hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. I don't want to keep pretending. I don't want to keep running away from what I feel. His words hung in the air, and I felt my heart race, a mixture of fear and hope swirling inside me. I wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that there was a way for us to make this work, to find a way to be together without losing ourselves in the process. But I also knew that life wasn't that simple. There were consequences, risks, things that could go wrong. And as much as I wanted to take the leap, I wasn't sure if I was ready. I don't know, Eric, I said, my voice trembling. I just don't want to hurt you, and I don't want to hurt myself. He nodded, a hint of sadness in his eyes. I get it. I just needed you to know how I feel. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of our shared understanding. We both knew that this was complicated, that there were no easy answers, no simple solutions. But as we sat there side by side, I felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of the bond we shared, whatever happened, whatever choices we made. I knew that this connection, this feeling, would always be a part of us, and in that moment, I felt a glimmer of hope, a possibility that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to make it work. As the night stretched on, we sat in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, but somehow together, in a way that felt deeper than words. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real, and for now, that was enough. The days that followed were a blur, an uneasy mix of tension, shared glances, and unspoken words. Each interaction felt loaded, every silence brimming with emotions. Neither of us knew how to handle. We both tried to go about our routines, to act as though nothing had changed, but the weight of our unacknowledged connection made everything feel surreal, like living in a dream we couldn't wake from. One evening, a chill had settled over the house, and I was on the porch watching the last traces of daylight fade into the night. The sky was painted in hues of deep orange and purple, a beautiful scene that felt out of place against the turmoil swirling in my chest, lost in thought. I didn't hear Eric approach until he spoke. Do you ever wish things were different? His voice was soft, almost hesitant, and I could feel the weight of his words before I even turned to face him. I looked over, surprised to see him standing there, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his face partially shadowed by the fading light. There was a vulnerability in his gaze that took me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. Sometimes I admitted my voice barely above a whisper, but life, it doesn't always give us what we want. He nodded, his eyes fixed on a spot in the distance, his expression contemplative. "I know," he said, almost to himself. "It just feels like we're both stuck, trapped in something we didn't ask for." The words hit me harder than I expected. In that moment, I realized just how much I understood, what he was feeling, how deeply I shared the same longing for something different, something easier. But we were here, bound by the choices we'd made, by the lives we'd built, and there was no going back. "We just have to make the best of it," I said, forcing a smile. "Find a way to move forward." He looked at me, his gaze searching, as if he were trying to find an answer to a question he couldn't put into words. "I don't know if I can," he said. Finally, his voice filled with an honesty that caught me off guard. "I don't know if I can keep pretending." There was a pause, a silence that stretched between us, filled with the weight of everything we'd left unsaid. I felt a pang of sadness, a longing for something I couldn't name, and I realized that deep down, I felt the same way. I was tired of pretending, of hiding behind walls that were crumbling with each passing day. "I don't want to pretend either," I admitted, my voice trembling, "but I don't know what else to do." He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving mine, and in that moment, I felt the full force of our connection, a bond that had grown stronger with every passing day, every shared glance, every unspoken word. It was a connection that defied logic, that transcended the boundaries. We'd both tried so hard to uphold. "I think we both know what we want," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart raced, a mixture of fear and longing, swelling inside me. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was written in the way my heart beat faster every time he was near, in the way my thoughts drifted to him at night, in the way his presence filled a void I hadn't even realized was there. Before I could respond, he took another step forward, closing the distance between us. His hand reached out, brushing lightly against mine, a touch so gentle it sent a shiver down my spine. I looked up at him, and in that moment, I saw the same emotions reflected in his gaze: fear, longing, and something deeper, something neither of us could put into words. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, and I felt my breath catch the world around us, fading into the background. There was no denying it now, no hiding from the truth we'd both been running from. And as his lips met mine, a soft, lingering kiss that felt like both an ending and a beginning. I realized that we were crossing a line we could never uncross. The kiss was gentle at first, a tentative exploration, as if we were both afraid to break the fragile connection between us. But as it deepened, as our bodies pressed closer, I felt a surge of emotions. I couldn't contain a longing that had been building for so long. It felt like it might consume me for a moment. Everything else faded away, the fears, the doubts, the consequences. All that mattered was this moment, this connection, this feeling that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. But all too soon, reality came crashing back. I pulled away, my heart racing, my mind reeling as I tried to process what had just happened. Eric looked at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and vulnerability, and I could see the same turmoil reflected in his gaze. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, feeling a wave of sadness wash over me. "I don't know. Eric, I really don't know." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of our shared understanding. We both knew that this couldn't continue, that there was no way to move forward without tearing apart the fragile stability we'd built. But the connection between us was too strong to ignore, too deep to simply walk away from. Finally, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to look at him. Maybe we need some time, some space to figure things out. He nodded, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. Yeah, maybe that's for the best. The days that followed were some of the hardest I'd ever experienced. We kept our distance, avoiding each other as much as possible. Each of us lost in our own thoughts, our own regrets. The house felt empty, hollow, as if the connection we'd shared had left a void that nothing could fill. But as painful as it was, I knew it was necessary. We both needed time to process what had happened, to figure out who we were, without the weight of our unspoken feelings hanging over us, and slowly, painfully, life went on. We went about our routines, our lives settling back into a semblance of normalcy. Though the tension between us never fully disappeared, there were moments, fleeting glances, and shared silences where I could feel the echo of what we'd shared. A reminder of the bond that would always be there, even if we never spoke of it again. One evening, months later, I found myself standing on the porch once more, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, a beautiful, peaceful scene that felt almost surreal against the turmoil that still lingered in my chest as I stood there, lost in thought. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned surprised to see Eric standing there, his expression soft, contemplative. We hadn't spoken about that night since it had happened, hadn't acknowledged the connection that still simmered beneath the surface. He stepped closer, his gaze steady, and for a moment I felt that familiar pang of longing, a yearning for something that could never be. I just wanted to say, "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. I looked at him, surprised by his words, for what he smiled. A sad, wistful smile for everything, for being there, for understanding, even when things got complicated. I nodded, my throat tightening as I fought back the wave of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. "You don't have to thank me, Eric. You were there for me too." We stood there in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our own regrets. And in that moment, I realized that while things would never be the same, while the bond we shared would always be a part of us, we had both found a way to move forward, to find peace. In the midst of the chaos, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the porch, I felt a strange sense of closure, a quiet acceptance of everything we'd been through. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was enough. And as I looked at Eric standing there with that same vulnerable expression, I knew that no matter what happened, we'd always have this connection, this understanding that went beyond words. We turned, walking back into the house, each of us carrying the weight of our shared history, our unspoken connection. It was a weight we'd carry for a long time, maybe even forever. But for the first time, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of the bond we'd shared, and the knowledge that no matter what, we'd always have each other.